Welcome back to Coordinating Clinical Trials. My name is Steve Pope, your instructor. And this week we're going to be talking about audits and inspections. So clinical trial audits are critical processes to ensure compliance with regulations, good clinical practice, and ethical guidelines. So I've included here the purpose, which comes from ICH E6 R2 section 5.19.1, and the purpose of a sponsor's audit, which is independent of and separate from routine monitoring or quality control functions, should be to evaluate trial conduct and compliance with the protocol, SOPs, GCP, and the applicable regulatory requirements. So let's take a look at our learning objectives. We're going to cite the purpose of audits and inspections. We're going to discuss the types of audits and inspections that you'll see. We'll describe some common audit findings. And then finally, we're going to contrast FDA Form 483 and FDA warning letters. So we'll talk about those, and so you'll be familiar with what those are. So let's begin by talking about the types of audits and inspections that you'll see. First of all, you have sponsor audits. Those are from the pharma company that's sponsoring the trial. You'll have regulatory inspections. Those come from the FDA or some other regulatory agency, but in almost 100% of the cases that you'll work on, they're going to be FDA inspections. You'll have some internal audits. Those might come from your organization, for instance, or they might come from a CRO. So the source of those can kind of differ, but they're very similar. And then finally, you'll have some vendor audits. Those might come from, say, an IRB or from a lab or some other vendor that you're working with. Let's talk about sponsor audits. These are more than likely going to be the most common that you'll deal with in your role as a clinical research coordinator. So these are going to be conducted by the trial sponsor, and they're really designed to assess compliance and data integrity. So they're going to send someone in. Normally they may have a consultant that they work with or a team of consultants. They might have their own employees that do it, but in many cases they'll probably have someone that's local to your area come and do an assessment. They'll kind of have some guidelines on what they're going to cover, what they're going to take a look at. Those audits probably will last a day, and then you'll get a follow-up letter from the auditor with any findings that they have. They should be able to discuss those with you before they leave. But your site is not going to get a report. That's going to go to the sponsor. So the findings will be communicated to you either from the auditor themselves or via their follow-up letter that you'll get probably a couple of weeks after the audit. So regulatory inspections are going to be conducted by the agency or agencies that have regulatory authority over the trial or trials that you're working on. These, in most every case, is going to be FDA. Although some of you might wind up working on trials that are have EMA or other regulatory agencies come and audit your site. But in most cases, it's going to be FDA. So they're going to come in there. They're probably going to spend multiple days. And they're going to give you a list of what they want to take a look at, what they're inspecting. So you should have a good idea of what they're going to take a look at when they show up. You're going to have internal audits. These are going to be performed by the clinical trial site or by a contract research organization, a CRO, who's working on behalf of the sponsor. And these are probably going to be done to identify issues before external inspection. So these may last a day or two. They're not going to be nearly as rigorous as an FDA inspection, but they are going to be important, and you do need to be aware of those, and you need to be be prepared for those, because those can occur at any time. You'll normally be given plenty of notice as to when they're going to take place, and so you'll be able to prepare yourself for those. And then finally, you're going to have vendor audits. These are conducted to assess compliance of third-party vendors like laboratories, data management companies, IRBs. They may, they may be done in conjunction with, say, a CRO audit or some other type of internal audit, but they do occur from time to time. Another type of internal audit that you might encounter is going to be audits done by third parties. There are companies out there that will do audits for sites. You pay them to come in and audit your site and see if they can identify areas that you need improvement in, or that you might need to tighten up and do better in, prior to having a real honest to goodness audit where you're going to have real findings. So those are examples of some of the audits that you're going to be participating in. So some of the key areas of focus for audits, and this would apply to any type of audit, whether it's a vendor audit, a sponsor audit, an FDA inspection. Essentially what they're going to be looking for is protocol adherence. Are you following the study protocol? Are you doing all the assessments that are required for the study protocol? Are those documented in the source data that you're collecting? They're going to review the informed consent process. Do you have original informed consent documents for each participant? Is there evidence that that participant was given an opportunity to answer questions, things like that? Is that process documented? Data integrity and source documentation, they want to see that. They want to make sure that every data component that you're entering into EDC is supported by a source document of some type, either an electronic medical record, or if it's on paper, or some type of e-source that's evident at the site. Adverse event reporting. This is something that's very important. Are you tracking adverse events? Are they being assessed by your principal investigator or a delegate? Are any serious adverse events reported to the sponsor within 24 hours? Are they reported to the IRB as per their reporting requirements? Regulatory compliance. Are you completing your investigator site file, keeping it up to date? Are you making submissions to the IRB? Those types of things. And then you got investigator and site responsibilities. Are people that are conducting specific tasks on the trial, do they have the appropriate training? Is there evidence of that training? Is there documentation of that training? So these are things they're going to look for in their audit process. So protocol adherence. We want to show evidence that we're conducting the trial according to the approved protocol. Do you have all the versions of the protocol in your investigator site file? Are they properly approved by your IRB? Are the scheduled events being conducted in accordance with what the protocol explains? I'm going to show you some warning letters later, and this is an area that often gets cited as a finding when FDA inspectors come out. The informed consent process. Are there original informed consent documents available for each subject? Are they properly signed and dated not only by the subject, but by the person who was consenting the subject. In some cases, they're required to be signed by the PI. Some states require the PI to sign the informed consent document. But that's becoming more and more of a requirement these days. A lot of sponsors are requiring that the PI be involved in the signing of those documents. Was the subject given a proper chance to answer questions? Did you follow your process? Were they able to take the informed consent home and read it over and then come back and complete the process? Those are things that the auditor is going to take a look at. Are you following your own SOP for consenting the participant during the trial? Data integrity and source documentation. Is everything accurate, complete, and verifiable? In many cases, the auditor themselves may or may not have access to the EDC database when they come out, but they're certainly going to take a look at your source documentation. They may review one or two subjects when they come out and just kind of get a feel for how you're documenting the collection of study data, and does it meet the Alcoa requirements for data collection and for proper documentation. In some cases, they may ask for access to your electronic medical record if you're using that to complete or to generate source from, to collect data from. So that could be a possibility. So these are things that they're going to need to work out with you ahead of time before they show up, because it's probably going to require some lead time to get access to those systems. Adverse event reporting. The proper recording and timely reporting of adverse events. They're going to want to look at this, particularly if your site has had serious adverse events. Were they reported to the sponsor on time? Were they reported to the IRB as appropriate? Were any follow-up reports submitted? Do you have a documentation process for how you handle those, how serious adverse events are reviewed? That's important, and it's something that all of the auditors are going to want to take a look at. Regulatory compliance, adherence to FDA governing body requirements. This is all going to be in your investigator site file. They're going to want to take a look at your 1572s and any of the other essential documents that you've collected there. Make sure the protocol signature page is signed off on. The investigator brochure acknowledgement of receipt is signed off on. You've got your delegation log is up to date and doesn't contain any errors. All of those things are going to be important, and that's what they're going to take a look at when they come out. Investigator and site responsibilities. As I alluded to earlier, they're going to want to scour over that delegation log and make sure that everything on there is correct. Do the people that are delegated certain tasks, do they have the training and experience to complete those tasks? Is the training documented? Do they require some type of certification in order to complete that task? These are all things that they're going to take a look at, and they're going to spend a lot of time reviewing your investigator site file. These are going to be some of the common findings and issues that they discover when they come to your site. Protocol deviations, incomplete or missing documentation, improper adverse event reporting, failure to follow good clinical practice or GCP. So let's take a look at some of these and we'll talk about them specifically. Protocol deviations. Failure to follow the study protocol. That is a common finding with many auditors and FDA inspectors that come out, and you'll find those listed in warning letters that go out to investigators that they've inspected. Now, they don't always send a warning letter, and we'll talk about those in a little more detail, but warning letters are public documents, so you can go out there and look at them, and you'll find that failure to follow the protocol is a very common finding. Incomplete or missing documentation. So poor record keeping, such as missing informed consent forms or other examples of record keeping errors, is something that's a common finding. Remember, if it wasn't documented, it didn't happen. If you don't have documentation that an assessment was done, then it wasn't done, and that can be a potential protocol deviation. So make sure you're documenting everything that you're doing at your site, and you've got an SOP or standard operating procedure for each task. So that way you've got a process to go by. Improper adverse event reporting. Failure to report or delays in reporting serious adverse events. These are either to reporting them to the sponsor or reporting them to the IRB. The other thing you want to do is anytime you've got a serious adverse event, you're going to collect medical records for that serious adverse event, because it's very likely the subject was treated in another facility. So you want to get those records, and you want to spend time going over them to make sure that there's not, an additional serious adverse event that was discovered while the patient, say, was in the hospital, for instance. You don't want some auditor finding that. So you want to be diligent in going through those records and making sure you've got everything covered. Common finding is failure to follow GCP guidelines. Issues with site management, including incomplete or inadequate management of the investigator site file, monitoring, and patient safety. So make sure that investigator site file is as up to date as possible, and it's what we call audit ready, which means it's ready for review by an auditor at any time. So that's very important, and it's something that, sometimes you get behind on that with all of the more pressing things that you're doing in your CRC role. And make sure when your monitor comes out, the monitor from the CRO or the sponsor, that they're actually reviewing that investigator site file for anything that's missing. That's very important. So you can rely on your monitor for that, to help you stay current as much as possible. Let's talk about preparing for an audit or inspection. So you've been notified by, say, the sponsor, for instance, that they want to conduct an audit at your site. They may give you maybe a month or 6 weeks or so notice on that, and you'll kind of go back and forth with them to establish what a suitable date for that will be. So in preparing for the audit, you want to maintain complete and organized records. You want to keep your investigator site file up to date. Make sure your drug accountability records are up to date, particularly if you're using a pharmacy, maybe an on-site pharmacy, because they're probably going to handle that. Hopefully, if you're using an on-site pharmacy, they're using some sort of pharmacy management accountability tools such as Vestigo or Velos or Incoop. There are a number of them out there. Vestigo is probably the most popular, but make sure they are aware of the audit, because the auditor is going to want to come visit the pharmacy while they're there, and they're probably going to want to have access to that system so they can check IP accountability. So that's something that you'll need to make sure you do before they show up. Make sure all trained staff and document training, all that documentation is up to date. Protocol training, any kind of assessment training, vendor training, that's something they want to see. Do you have training to use the EDC system? Do you have training on maybe an ECG system or some type of imaging system or something like spirometry? Those kinds of things usually are handled by a vendor, and so you're probably going to need to have training on that before you can begin the trial. So make sure you've got all that documentation properly filed. You can also conduct internal or mock audits. These are beneficial because if you work in a large organization, they may have a team of people that can actually perform those, and those can be very helpful. There's also third parties that you can hire that will come in and perform audits at your site, and that can be very useful as well in helping make sure you've got everything covered that you need to have covered. And then finally, you want to make sure that you're responding to the findings in a prompt manner. We'll take a look, we'll talk about that a little bit further in the lesson. So let's talk about what you're going to do during the audit or inspection. What should you be doing? This can't be stressed enough. Cooperate fully with the auditor or the inspector. Um, they should be able to come up and tell you what they need. If it's an FDA inspection, they're going to show up. They're going to have credentials. Make sure you check those. Make sure you write down the person's name and their badge number or whatever credential number they have. You can't make a copy of it, but you can write down the information so you know without a doubt who showed up to perform that inspection. Auditors are not going to have that. They're not going to have credentials necessarily. They're going to tell you who they are. Make sure or ensure that the PI is available to talk with the auditor. Make sure you schedule the date on a time when you and the PI are available, and any other personnel or staff members that you think need to be available are indeed available. So you don't want to have a real busy day when that auditor shows up. You want to kind of clear your schedule and make sure you're available to work with that person when they come. You want to provide a quiet and private place for the auditor to work, such as a conference room or an empty office. This is very important, and this is something that some people overlook. So put them in a conference room. You get to decide where they work. They don't get to decide that. So you put them in there. That way they can't see around and see what else is going on at your site and that type of thing. You don't want them in a room where you've got binders from some other study or other information that they can have access to, because anything they see, they can say, hey, I'd like to take a look at that, and you're required to provide it for them. Next, provide only what the auditor asks for. If they're there to audit on a specific study, they'll tell you what they want. If they want to see, say, 2 subject binders, for instance, they'll probably tell you which subjects they want to take a look at, and you provide that for them. But don't provide them with information that they do not ask for. So that's very important. So make sure you've got a good sense of what they want to take a look at when they show up. You want to be available to the auditor to respond to requests and questions. Don't go run and hide in your office, or don't run out for lunch someplace. Bring your lunch that day. If that's something you don't do on a regular basis, make sure you're there all day, because that auditor is going to be there all day. Until their work is finished. And then the good thing, if you're going through an FDA inspection, ask them for a summary of observations after each day, because they're probably going to be there for multiple days. So when they respond to that, you'll kind of get a pretty good idea of what they're looking at, and you'll probably be able to head off any potential problems or any potential discrepancies between what they're finding, what's actually the case. So ask for them to provide, it can just be an oral summary. Hey, these are the things that I've discovered so far that I'll probably be looking at in subsequent days, and you can begin to address those as they come up. So once the audit is over, you've got some post-audit actions to take. First of all, if it's a sponsor audit, they're going to provide you with a follow-up letter. You're not going to get the report. You're going to get a follow-up letter, and it's going to identify the items that they found, and then you're probably going to get some follow-up from your monitor, because the sponsor themselves, or the CRO, is probably going to wind up with a list of things they have to help fix. Some of those are things that you need to help with. A lot of them are going to be things that they themselves need to do. So, and you'll probably get that follow-up letter a couple weeks after the audit. If you don't get it, you should ask for it. For FDA inspections and reports of findings, when the FDA comes in and they find things, they're going to issue a Form 483, which is a notice of observations. So these might be things that are kind of minor, but it'll be things that you haven't addressed during the audit. So they're probably going to require some addressing once they're finished. And then finally, you're going to have responses and corrective actions. So you're going to need to be able to document what those corrective actions are. You might have to do what's known as a CAPA, which is corrective actions and preventative actions. Most cases, you're not going to need to do that. That's a much more formal process that I would highly recommend that you avoid that as much as possible. But you will need to be able to respond to the findings when they come up. So for FDA inspections, you have what's known as a notice of inspection, which is a Form 482. I put a copy of it out there on Blackboard for you to take a look at. It's a pretty simple form. They just tell you they want to show up, and these are the things they want to look at. So they're required to provide that for you prior to prior to the inspection. Once they conduct the inspection and they have findings, they're going to issue what's called a Form 483, and that's going to be something that identifies what items they found and what they what they expect the corrective actions to be. And once they do that, then you're going to have your responses and corrective actions to take, which means you're going to need to either discuss that with them at the time that they're there, or you may need to follow up later in writing to address those findings. And then finally, FDA warning letters, we'll kind of get into those here in just a moment. So let's talk about FDA inspections and some of the common observations. First one is going to be inadequate or insufficient documentation of procedures, testing, or quality control. These are going to be inadequate standard operating procedures. Inadequate training of personnel in relevant procedures or quality control. Inadequate or insufficient investigation or correction of deviations or complaints. Failure to follow established procedures or the protocol. You can also have equipment facilities that are deficient, and that could affect subject safety. You've also got inadequate validation of processes or equipment. Things like calibration records. That's something very important. You should be keeping track of that. Failure to properly handle or store or label the study drug. Once again, that's something that you have responsibility over. They may find that in the pharmacy, but ultimately the principal investigator is responsible for everything that occurs at that site. So that can result in a finding. Failure to establish or maintain adequate records or logs, things like subject enrollment logs, IP accountability logs, lab specimen collection logs and shipment logs. Things like that are very important. Failure to properly report adverse events. We've discussed that earlier. Usually that can be a big finding, particularly as it relates to serious adverse events. So I alluded to FDA Form 483 and warning letters. So there's a difference between the two. So FDA Form 483 is used to document any observations of potential non-compliance for FDA regulations and is named after the section of the Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act that authorizes inspections. On the other hand, an FDA warning letter is used after an inspection and is a formal notification of serious non-compliance, demanding prompt or corrective action. So as I just alluded to a little earlier, warning letters, FDA warning letters, are actually public documents that are available at this URL that you see on your screen there. I've actually posted a couple of them on Blackboard for you to take a look at and kind of get an idea of what those warning letters look like and some of the things, some of the potential non-compliance that's identified in those. So take a look and you can kind of take a look at those yourself. So this table here shows you the differences between an FDA 43 and a warning letter. So if you see over on the left-hand side, that first column indicates a feature such as timing, severity, purpose, response, and consequences. So the 43 is issued at the end of an inspection. Meanwhile, a warning letter is typically issued after an inspection and often after an inadequate response to a Form 43. Important that the 43 lists the investigator's observations of potential violations. It tends to be less severe. The warning letter is more severe. The purpose of a 43 is to notify the inspected party of concerns and allow for voluntary correction. Then the warning letter is to formally notify the inspected party of serious non-compliance and then what they're going to do to get that corrective action going. Then as far as the response goes, for 43, responding is critical to avoid the warning letter, so you want to make sure you get that 43. You want to respond to it and respond to it adequately so you don't get that warning letter. Then the warning letter, as far as response goes, requires some kind of comprehensive response to avoid further penalties. So then, finally, the consequences for the 43 could lead to a warning letter, but then for the warning letter itself could lead to other regulatory penalties. So you want to make sure that you have that, because you certainly don't want to get your PI on the disbarment list, because then you won't be able to work on any trials. So these are the kind of the differences between the FDA Form 43 and the FDA warning letter. So let's talk about the 43 and how to avoid findings or observations. We probably touched on most of these during the lesson, but let's kind of reinforce some of them as we go along here. First of all, maintain standard operating procedures or SOPs, training and documentation practices. Ensure that all staff are properly trained on site functions and procedures and document the training. Finally, you want to conduct internal audits or use a third-party consultant. They can help. And then you want to respond to the issues when they arise. If you can deal with these, while the inspector is there, that can be a big help to avoiding these observations and avoiding a 43. Here are your reading assignments for the week. You've got a chapter from the textbook to take a look at. It's not very long. I think it's only about 10 pages or so. And then And then I put some articles up there that'll help amplify what I've gone over in this lecture, and I think will help you get a better feel for audits and how to prepare for them, and what all is involved in that. So here are the rest of the reading assignments for the week. These will be posted out on Blackboard. That last one there, I've included that link to a nice article from ACRP that I think will really help you understand the importance of audits and inspections. And then finally, for your discussion forum for this week, for your practical exercise, what I've done is I've put a clinical trial audit preparation checklist out there for you. It's a Word document in Blackboard, and I'd like for you to complete it. What I've done is I've started it for you, so I'd like for you to go ahead and complete it with things that you think should be on that preparation checklist. Now, I want you to understand there's no right or wrong answer on some of these. This is a good exercise for you to help prepare your own checklist and help you get thinking about audits and how to prepare for them. And then finally, at the end of the lesson, at the conclusion, I'll post a completed checklist that you can use to compare with your own. And as you post those, I'll be commenting on them on Blackboard. So good luck with the assignment, and I'll see you online.